I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow. Throughout her life,
King Charles has unexpectedly discovered something that changed everything between him and Camilla after Prince William handed him a report filled with shocking details about the Queen Consort's activities. The document revealed troubling behavior that had been going on right under the king's nose for months. Charles read through the pages, unable to come to terms with it. But within days, the warmth between the king and his wife freezed. By the time Camilla tried to understand what went wrong, it was already too late. What did William uncover that destroyed the royal marriage? Join us as we uncover Camilla's hidden intentions. The arrival of the secret report. The evening settled quietly over Buckingham Palace as King Charles sat in his private study reviewing the day's papers. The room felt peaceful, with only the soft ticking of an antique clock breaking the silence. Heavy curtains blocked out the London night while a small desk lamp provided warm light across his mahogany desk. Charles had dismissed his staff an hour earlier, seeking solitude after a long day of public duties and official meetings. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts around 9:30 in the evening. Charles looked up from the document spread before him as his most trusted aide entered the room. The man carried a single manila envelope held carefully in both hands. His expression appeared unusually serious for such a late delivery. Charles noticed immediately that something about this particular correspondence felt different from the routine materials he received daily. The aide approached the desk and placed the envelope down with care. He explained that Prince William had sent the package with specific instructions for private delivery. The contents were marked as confidential and personal, meant only for the king's eyes. Charles thanked the aide and dismissed him, watching as the heavy door closed with a soft click. The king found himself alone again, staring at the sealed envelope that now held his attention. Charles reached for the envelope and examined it carefully under the lamplight. The paper quality suggested official palace stationery rather than casual correspondence. William's personal seal marked the closure, pressed firmly into red wax. The weight of the envelope indicated substantial contents inside, perhaps a dozen pages or more. Charles felt a rush of concern in his chest, wondering what could require such secretive delivery from his eldest son. He broke the wax seal carefully and withdrew a neatly bound report from inside. The first page bore a simple title without unnecessary detail. Charles adjusted his reading glasses and began scanning the opening paragraphs. His breath caught slightly as he realized this document concerned Camilla and her activities within the palace. The king had expected discussions about upcoming royal tours, or perhaps concerns about public relations strategies. Charles read slowly through the introduction, which outlined William's purpose for compiling the information. His son explained the decision to document these matters had not come easily. William wrote that loyalty to family competed with duty to the crown and the institution they all served. The Prince of Wales talked about weeks of careful observation and consultation with trusted palace personnel. He emphasized that every claim in the report could be verified through multiple independent sources. The king continued reading as the report moved into specific incidents and patterns of behavior. His expression grew increasingly troubled with each new page. Charles found himself checking details twice, unable to quite believe what the words described. The document painted a picture of activities and decisions that had occurred right under his nose. Small things he had noticed but dismissed now appeared in a completely different context when assembled together. Charles reached the end of the first section and set the papers down on his desk. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, feeling suddenly exhausted. The clock showed nearly 10 o'clock. He had been reading for 20 minutes, though it felt like mere seconds. The king stood and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to stare out at the palace grounds. His mind raced through recent memories, searching for signs he should have recognized earlier. Charles recalled conversations with Camilla that now seemed deliberately vague or evasive. He remembered staff members who had appeared uncomfortable in the Queen Consort's presence. There had been moments when trusted advisors seemed to hesitate before speaking freely during meetings where Camilla attended. All these small observations had floated past his awareness without connecting into any coherent pattern. Charles returned to his desk and picked up the report again. He forced himself to read more slowly this time, absorbing every detail William had documented. The pages included dates, locations, and descriptions of specific incidents. His son had clearly spent considerable time and effort gathering this information. The thoroughness of the documentation made casual dismissal impossible. William would never bring such serious matters forward without absolute certainty about the facts. The king read through testimony from household staff who described feeling pressured or intimidated. He reviewed accounts of private meetings Camilla had conducted without his knowledge or approval. Charles examined records of personnel changes that had occurred through channels that bypassed normal protocols. Each piece of evidence stood alone as potentially explainable, but together they formed a disturbing picture of calculated maneuvering. Charles finished reading the final page as midnight approached. He sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the leather against his shoulders. He understood that his relationship with Camilla had just changed. The woman he had married, the woman he had fought so hard to have accepted as his queen consort, now appeared in a light he had never imagined possible. Charles locked the report in his desk drawer and sat alone in the study, contemplating the difficult path that stretched ahead. Details of William's disturbing discoveries. The report's second section detailed the first incident that had caught William's attention 3 months earlier. A senior household manager with 20 years of faithful service had suddenly requested a transfer to a minor administrative position. The individual had worked closely with both Charles and Camilla, managing daily schedules and coordinating palace operations. William had found the transfer request strange given the person's record, so he made discreet inquiries and discovered the staff member had been called to a private meeting with Camilla. According to the documentation, Camilla had questioned the household manager's loyalty during their conversation. She suggested that certain staff members seemed more devoted to preserving old ways than embracing her vision for how things should operate. The queen consort implied that people who could not adapt to her leadership style might find themselves in trouble. At the end of the meeting, the household manager left feeling distinctly threatened despite the polite language Camilla had used. William's investigation uncovered 2 additional cases that followed an identical pattern within the following weeks. Both involved long-serving palace employees who had worked their way up through the ranks over decades. These persons possessed deep institutional knowledge about royal protocols and traditional practices. Each found themselves feeling undermined by Camilla and insecure about their positions. Within days, both submitted requests for transfers to positions with significantly reduced responsibilities. The report included careful documentation of how Camilla had filled the resulting vacancies. She brought in individuals from outside the traditional palace recruitment channels. These new staff members lacked the extensive experience typically required for such sensitive positions. However, they shared a common characteristic of personal loyalty to Camilla rather than to the institution itself. William noted that these appointees began forming an inner circle around the queen consort, handling communications and controlling access in ways that bypassed established protocols. William's research revealed that Camilla had been holding regular meetings with this new group of advisors. The gatherings occurred in her private apartments during times when Charles attended to other duties. The discussions focused on restructuring palace operations and reassigning responsibilities. Several attendees later reported feeling encouraged to view themselves as part of a modernization effort led by the queen consort. The meetings cultivated a sense of exclusive membership in Camilla's inner circle. The Prince of Wales documented how information flow within the palace had subtly shifted over these months. Decisions that traditionally required consultation with senior advisors began happening through informal channels. Staff members who raised questions about proper procedures found themselves left out. A culture of uncertainty developed where people hesitated to follow established protocols if doing so might displease the queen consort. The institutional knowledge that had guided palace operations for generations was being systematically dismissed as outdated thinking. William included testimony from multiple sources describing how Camilla was making statements about her role and authority. She suggested to various staff members that her position as queen consort carried more weight than people seemed to recognize. The queen consort reminded people that she stood beside the king and therefore her wishes deserved the same respect as direct orders from Charles himself. These comments created confusion about proper chains of command and reporting structures. The report detailed financial loopholes that had emerged during this same period. Certain budget allocations for the queen consort's office had increased substantially without going through normal approval processes. Expenses appeared on palace accounts that did not match established spending patterns. When questioned by financial administrators, Camilla's new staff provided vague answers. The amounts involved were not huge, but the lack of transparency violated fiscal accountability standards. There were also trusted advisors who expressed growing concern about their diminishing access to Charles. These experienced counselors reported that Camilla had begun intercepting certain communications before they reached the king. She would review matters first and then decide what information Charles actually needed to see. The Queen Consort framed this intervention as helpfully filtering unnecessary details, but the advisors recognized it as control over information flow while stripping away important context. The Prince of Wales included evidence of how Camilla had started positioning herself in public-facing activities. She had been suggesting changes to planned royal events that would increase her prominence relative to other family members. The Queen Consort proposed alterations to seating arrangements, speaking orders, and photo opportunities that elevated her visibility. When event coordinators pushed back, citing traditional protocols, Camilla's staff would apply pressure by invoking her authority as the king's wife. William's report concluded this section with a summary of the overall pattern. The individual incidents might each seem minor when viewed separately. A staff transfer here, a budget question there, some suggestions about event planning. However, the cumulative effect revealed a systematic effort to build personal power independent of proper institutional channels. Camilla appeared to be constructing a parallel structure of authority within the palace, one that answered to her alone rather than serving the crown as an institution. William emphasized that he had verified every claim through multiple independent sources and could provide additional documentation if Charles required further proof. The Prince of Wales expressed deep concern that allowing these patterns to continue would fundamentally undermine the stability Charles had worked so hard to establish since becoming king. Now, it was time for the king to decide how to handle the Charles confronts the evidence. Charles spread William's report across his desk the following morning and began the difficult process of checking each claim against his own observations. The king maintained detailed personal diaries that recorded not just official business but also his impressions of daily palace life. He pulled out the leather-bound volumes covering the past several months and started cross-referencing dates. The first incident William documented about the household manager's transfer had occurred on a Tuesday in early September. Charles flipped to that week in his diary and found an entry noting that Camilla seemed preoccupied and less communicative than usual that evening. The king continued methodically through the timeline William had constructed. For each significant event in the report, Charles searched his diaries for corresponding entries. He discovered numerous small notations that suddenly took on new meaning. There were days when he had recorded feeling oddly out of touch with palace operations. Moments when staff members seemed hesitant to speak freely in his presence. Occasions when Camilla had steered conversations away from certain topics or people. At the time, these observations had seemed too minor to warrant concern. Now they formed pieces of a larger puzzle. Charles recalled a specific morning in October when he had asked about the household manager's transfer. Camilla had explained it as a personal choice by the staff member who wanted reduced responsibilities before retirement. The king had accepted this explanation without question, trusting his wife's account completely. He now realized he had never actually spoken directly with the household manager about the decision. Camilla had smoothly inserted herself as the sole source of information, and Charles had failed to verify the story independently. The king examined his schedule from recent months with fresh perspective. He noticed patterns in when Camilla had suggested he attend certain meetings or skip others. There were events she had encouraged him to handle personally, while volunteering to manage different matters herself. Charles had appreciated what seemed like helpful partnership in managing their workload. The division of responsibilities had appeared natural and efficient. Only now could he see how these arrangements had systematically isolated him from specific areas of palace operations. Charles remembered a conversation with one of his longest-serving advisors who had mentioned feeling less consulted on important decisions. The advisor had phrased the concern carefully, almost apologetically, suggesting perhaps the king preferred to handle matters through different channels now. Charles had reassured the advisor that his counsel remained valued but had not investigated why this perception existed. The king now understood that Camilla had been gradually limiting these trusted voices from reaching him. The financial irregularities William documented prompted Charles to request detailed budget reports from palace administrators. He spent an entire afternoon reviewing expense accounts and authorization records. The king discovered exactly what his son had described. Increased spending from the Queen Consort's office had bypassed normal approval processes. When Charles looked for the documentation trail that should exist for such expenditures, he found only vague justifications submitted after the fact. The pattern of avoiding proper oversight troubled him deeply. Charles pulled out correspondence files and began reviewing communications from various palace departments. He searched for the kinds of detailed briefings and comprehensive reports he typically received on all significant matters. The king noticed that information reaching his desk over recent months had become noticeably more filtered and summarized. Complex issues arrived with simple recommendations attached, leaving little room for consideration. Camilla had often been the one delivering these condensed briefings, explaining she wanted to save him from unnecessary details. The king thought back to recent royal events and public appearances. He visualized the arrangements, seating plans, and order of activities. Charles realized that his position relative to other family members had subtly shifted in different ways. The changes had been small enough to seem invalid. When viewed cumulatively over several months, however, they represented a significant departure from traditional protocols. The king had signed off on these arrangements without recognizing the pattern because each alteration came with reasonable-sounding explanations. Charles spent hours that day reviewing security logs that tracked movement throughout the palace. He examined records showing when and where Camilla had held meetings in her private apartments. The frequency and timing of these gatherings matched exactly what William had documented. The king noticed these meetings often occurred during times when he was occupied with specific duties that kept him away from that wing of the palace. The scheduling seemed too consistent to be coincidental. The king confronted the most painful realization as evening approached. He had to acknowledge his own role in allowing this situation to develop. Charles had been so focused on his official duties and so eager to demonstrate trust in Camilla that he had stopped applying normal oversight. He had wanted their partnership to work smoothly and had interpreted that desire as reason to avoid asking difficult questions. The king had confused blind trust with healthy confidence, and that confusion had created space for problems to grow. Every piece of evidence William had gathered checked out against independent verification. The king could no longer pretend these were misunderstandings or minor missteps. Camilla had been systematically building personal power and undermining institutional structures. She had done so carefully, and right under his nose. Charles faced the devastating truth that his wife had betrayed not just his trust, but the very institution they were supposed to serve together. So what was he to do next? The cold treatment begins. Charles entered the breakfast room the next morning to find Camilla already seated with her usual tea and newspapers. The king offered a brief nod instead of his customary kiss on her cheek. He took his seat at the opposite end of the table rather than in the adjacent chair he normally occupied. Camilla looked up with surprise, but Charles had already buried his attention in the morning briefing papers. The Queen Consort attempted light conversation about the day's schedule, receiving only minimal responses that ended the discussion before it could develop. The king finished his breakfast quickly and departed without the leisurely conversation that typically marked their morning routine. Camilla sat alone at the table, confused by the sudden change in his behavior. She assumed Charles was simply preoccupied with some pressing state matter and decided not to press the issue. The Queen Consort had no way of knowing that this cold reception marked the beginning of a permanent shift in their relationship. Charles instructed his private secretary to arrange separate transportation for all upcoming royal engagements. The king explained he needed flexibility in his schedule that joint travel would not accommodate. His staff found the request unusual but implemented the changes without question. Camilla discovered the new arrangements when she was informed that her car would leave 15 minutes after the king's for an event they were both attending. The separation felt uncomfortable. The king stopped attending the regular evening briefings where he and Camilla had traditionally reviewed the next day's activities together. Charles began receiving these updates alone in his study, making decisions without seeking her input. Palace staff noticed the change immediately and adjusted their reporting procedures accordingly. Documents and requests that previously went to both the king and queen consort now moved only through Charles's office. Camilla found herself increasingly isolated from the flow of information that governed daily palace operations. Charles arranged for his personal belongings to be moved from the private apartments he shared with Camilla. The king established residence in a separate wing of the palace that had previously served as guest quarters. He framed the move as temporary, citing the need for quiet space to handle sensitive matters requiring his undivided attention. The physical separation meant their paths crossed less frequently, and even chance encounters became awkward exchanges of polite formalities rather than genuine connection. The queen consort attempted to arrange a private dinner where they could reconnect away from palace pressures. She sent several requests through proper channels, suggesting various dates that might fit Charles's schedule. Each attempt received a polite response, citing unavoidable conflicts or prior commitments. Camilla began to understand that her husband was actively avoiding time alone with her, though she still could not identify what had triggered this dramatic change in his attitude. Palace staff observed the new dynamic and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Servants and administrators who had previously sought approval from both the king and queen consort now directed all requests solely to Charles. The king made clear through his actions that Camilla's opinions on household matters no longer carried weight in his decision-making process. This shift in protocol sent signals throughout the palace hierarchy about the queen consort's diminished standing. Charles excluded Camilla from planning sessions for upcoming royal tours scheduled for the following year. The king had always involved her in these preparations, valuing her perspective on public engagement strategies. Now he conducted these discussions with William and other senior royals, while Camilla received only basic information about finalized plans. The queen consort found herself treated as a participant who would be informed what to do rather than a partner who helped shape the approach. The charitable initiatives that Charles and Camilla had previously managed as joint projects were reorganized. The king removed her name from leadership positions on several foundation boards they had co-chaired. He reassigned her responsibilities to other family members without explanation or discussion. Camilla discovered these changes when revised organizational charts appeared in official palace communications. The public nature of her demotion added humiliation to the growing sense of isolation. Charles began communicating with Camilla exclusively through formal written channels. His personal secretary would deliver notes outlining necessary information about shared obligations or required coordination for public events. The messages were brief, factual, and devoid of any personal warmth. The king treated his wife with the same professional distance he might show to a minor government official rather than his life partner and closest companion. The queen consort noticed that mutual friends within their social circles suddenly became less available. People who had regularly joined them for private dinners or weekend gatherings now declined invitations or claimed scheduling conflicts. Camilla did not realize that Charles had discreetly indicated to these friends that he preferred to maintain distance from her in social settings. The isolation extended beyond palace walls into her personal life, leaving her with fewer people to confide in about her growing concerns. Camilla attempted to approach Charles directly one evening when they both attended a small family gathering. She tried to create a moment for private conversation, but the king deftly avoided being alone with her. He positioned himself in group discussions and excused himself whenever she moved in his direction. The deliberate avoidance was obvious enough that other family members noticed the tension, though no one felt the need to address it openly. When she couldn't take it any longer, the queen consort sent a heartfelt letter to Charles expressing confusion about the distance between them. She wrote that she sensed something had changed and asked for the opportunity to understand what had gone wrong. The king's response arrived 2 days later as a single typed paragraph. He stated that he would communicate any necessary information through appropriate channels. The coldness of that reply left Camilla both hurt and frightened about what might come next. Camilla's growing desperation. Camilla initially tried to maintain her normal routine despite the obvious chill in Charles's behavior. The queen consort attended her scheduled engagements and fulfilled public obligations with pretense. She smiled for photographers and conducted herself with the dignity expected of her position. Behind the public facade, however, confusion and anxiety steadily consumed her thoughts. Every interaction with Charles felt strained and artificial. completely unlike the comfortable partnership they had built over decades together. The queen consort began paying closer attention to palace dynamics, searching for clues about what might have triggered this dramatic shift. She noticed how staff members who once sought her guidance now directed all inquiries to the king's office. People who had previously engaged her in friendly conversations suddenly became formal and distant. Camilla sensed that everyone around her knew something she did not, and their careful politeness only increased her feeling of isolation. She attempted to reach out to William, thinking perhaps the Prince of Wales might help her understand what had changed with his father. Camilla sent a request for a private meeting to discuss family matters. William's office responded after several days with a note explaining that his schedule was extremely full with upcoming commitments. The polite refusal felt significant given that William had always made time for family discussions before. The queen consort began to suspect that whatever had poisoned her relationship with Charles might involve other family members as well. Camilla turned to a close friend outside the royal family, someone she had known for years before marrying Charles. She arranged a lunch at a private location where they could speak freely without palace staff observing. The queen consort described the situation carefully, trying not to sound paranoid or overly dramatic. Her friend listened but offered little useful insight. The conversation left Camilla feeling somewhat better temporarily, but the relief faded as soon as she returned to the palace's cold atmosphere. The queen consort decided to address the situation more directly by sending another letter to Charles. This message asked specific questions about whether she had offended him or failed in some responsibility. Camilla suggested they might benefit from a quiet weekend away from palace pressures where they could reconnect. She referenced happy times from their past and expressed hope that whatever had come between them could be resolved. Charles's response this time around stated that his schedule would not permit any personal travel in the foreseeable future. Camilla began experiencing difficulty sleeping as worry dominated her thoughts during the night. She would lie awake reviewing recent months, trying to identify the exact moment when everything had changed. The queen consort replayed conversations and events in her mind, searching for the mistake she must have made. The uncertainty felt worse than direct confrontation would have been. At least anger or accusation would provide something concrete to address. She noticed that invitations to certain palace functions no longer arrived at her office. Events where her presence had been assumed now proceeded without any expectation of her attendance. Camilla discovered these exclusions when she happened to overhear staff discussing arrangements for gatherings she knew nothing about. The realization that she was being deliberately bypassed in planning struck her as deeply humiliating. The queen consort attempted to maintain connections with her inner circle of staff and advisors. However, she began noticing that even these loyal individuals seemed uncomfortable around her now. Conversations became awkward and stilted. People who had once shared palace gossip and insider information now offered only bland pleasantries. Camilla understood that her isolation was becoming total, cutting her off from the informal networks that provided essential context for navigating palace life. She made one more attempt to bridge the gap with Charles by attending an event where she knew he would be present. Camilla arrived early and positioned herself where he would have to acknowledge her when he entered. The king offered a minimal greeting before moving to the opposite side of the room. Throughout the evening, Charles managed to avoid any substantial interaction despite being in the same space for over 2 hours. The deliberate snub in front of other guests made clear that this situation had moved beyond private disagreement. Camilla experienced her first genuine panic about the future during a long afternoon alone in her apartments. The queen consort realized that she had no real power, independent of Charles's support. Her position, her influence, her entire public role existed only through their relationship. If he chose to completely freeze her out, she possessed no institutional standing to resist. The frightening vulnerability of her situation became impossible to ignore. She reached out again to the friend she had confided in earlier, this time with greater urgency in her voice. Camilla admitted that the situation was worsening rather than improving. She described feeling like a ghost in her own home, present but invisible, occupying space without truly existing in any meaningful way. Her friend offered sympathy but could suggest no practical solutions. The call ended with Camilla feeling even more isolated and desperate. The queen consort began noticing physical symptoms of the stress she was experiencing. Her appetite decreased and her digestion became unreliable. Headaches appeared frequently, particularly in the evening hours. Camilla found herself becoming short-tempered with staff over minor issues, then immediately regretting her sharp words. The loss of control over her emotions frightened her almost as much as the situation itself. She spent hours reviewing everything she knew about palace protocol and royal history, searching for precedents that might explain what was happening. Camilla looked for examples of other royals who had fallen from favor and how they had managed the situation. Most historical examples involved public scandal or loss rather than this kind of cold internal exile. The queen consort realized she was experiencing something unusual, a form of punishment that left her position technically intact while stripping away all real influence and connection. The new palace reality. Charles soon implemented new protocols, issuing directives through his private secretary establishing that all significant decisions required his personal review and written authorization. No department head could make changes to staffing, budgets, or procedures without submitting detailed proposals directly to the king's office. The new system created multiple layers of oversight that effectively eliminated opportunities for anyone to exercise independent authority. Charles intended these changes to be permanent rather than temporary. The advisory council that Charles formed included William prominently, along with several long-serving counselors whose experience and loyalty were unquestioned. The king scheduled regular meetings with this group to review all major palace operations and upcoming royal activities. These sessions happened in the king's private study, with attendance strictly limited to invited members. Camilla received no invitation to join the council, and her name appeared nowhere on the official membership roster. Camilla's daily schedule began to reflect her diminished role through subtle but significant changes. The queen consort still received invitations to major state functions and ceremonial events where her absence would attract unwanted public attention. However, her participation became purely performative rather than substantive. She appeared at required moments, smiled for cameras, and fulfilled basic representational duties. Behind the scenes, staff treated her with correct formality while making clear through their behavior that real authority rested elsewhere. The king systematically reassigned responsibilities that Camilla had held to other family members and trusted administrators. Charitable foundations where she had served as patron or board member received polite letters explaining organizational restructuring. New leadership arrangements emerged that maintained the royal connection, while removing the queen consort from positions of actual influence. The changes happened gradually enough to avoid generating major news coverage, but people within royal circles understood their significance. Public appearances continued on schedule, with Charles and Camilla appearing together as required by their positions. The king maintained appropriate courtesy during these joint engagements, standing beside her for photographs and acknowledging her presence in public remarks. Their body language remained professional and correct without suggesting either warmth or obvious conflict. The careful maintenance of appearances protected the monarchy's image, while allowing the internal reality to be completely different. Camilla found herself living in a strange kind of limbo, where her title remained intact but her power had evaporated completely. The queen consort maintained her apartments and staff, received her allowances, and occupied her official position. However, she exercised no real influence over palace decisions or royal family activities. Every aspect of her daily life happened at the discretion of others who followed the king's wishes rather than hers. The psychological impact of this powerlessness weighed heavily despite the continuation of material comforts and public status. The inner circle of staff members Camilla had recruited found themselves gradually moved to positions where they handled routine administrative tasks far from centers of influence. None were fired outright, but their responsibilities shrank until they effectively held make-work positions. Several chose to resign rather than accept the demotion. Others stayed but understood clearly that their prospects for advancement had disappeared. The network Camilla had tried to build dissolved as people recognized that association with her carried no benefits and potential costs. Charles made clear through consistent actions that his trust, once broken, would not be easily restored. The king never discussed the situation directly with Camilla, never explained his knowledge of her activities, never gave her opportunities to defend herself or negotiate better terms. The absolute nature of his withdrawal left no room for appeals or arguments. Camilla existed in a state of permanent exile within her own home, technically present but functionally invisible when it came to anything that mattered. William's prominent role in the new structure became increasingly clear to palace observers. The Prince of Wales attended meetings and consultations that previous heirs had not regularly joined. He traveled with Charles for important engagements and appeared in photographs that emphasized the father-son partnership. The king was positioning William not just as future monarch but as present partner in governing the institution. This visible closeness served multiple purposes, both strengthening the succession and showing where real power resided. The queen consort faced a choice between accepting her diminished circumstances or creating public conflict that would damage both herself and the institution she had married into. Camilla recognized that any attempt to fight back openly would generate the kind of scandal that destroys reputations forever. The British public had only grudgingly accepted her after years of careful rehabilitation from the controversies of the past. Creating new drama would undo all that painstaking work and leave her completely isolated. She chose passive acceptance as the only viable path forward, however painful that surrender felt. The new palace reality settled into a sustainable pattern over the following months. Charles continued his duties as king, with renewed confidence in the systems protecting institutional integrity. William grew more comfortable in his expanded role as trusted advisor and visible partner. The two men developed working rhythms that allowed them to coordinate effectively on sensitive matters. Their alliance provided stability and continuity that reassured both palace staff and the broader establishment about the monarchy's direction. Camilla learned to navigate her reduced existence with as much dignity as circumstances allowed. The queen consort focused on the limited charitable activities still available to her and the few remaining public engagements on her calendar. She maintained proper behavior during required interactions with Charles, never pushing for confrontations or explanations she understood would not come. The marriage continued as a legal and formal reality while ceasing to function as a genuine partnership in any meaningful sense. Charles occasionally reflected on how drastically his circumstances had changed in such a short time. The king remembered the hope and optimism he had felt about building a successful reign with Camilla as his partner and supporter. That vision had been destroyed by her choices and his own delayed recognition of warning signs. The disappointment remained sharp, but Charles had learned to channel those feelings into determination about protecting the institution. Personal happiness had become secondary to fulfilling his responsibilities to the crown and the nation. The queen consort sometimes wondered whether she could have made different choices that would have led to better outcomes. Camilla recognized in quiet moments that her desire for influence and control had driven her toward actions that ultimately destroyed the very security she sought. The irony was not lost on her that attempting to consolidate power had resulted in losing nearly all of it. These reflections brought regret, but no clear path toward redemption or restoration of what had been lost. William carried the burden of knowing his intervention had altered his father's marriage and family dynamics. The Prince of Wales never doubted that bringing forward the information had been necessary and right. However, he felt the weight of having triggered consequences that caused pain, even while protecting the institution. William maintained his commitment to supporting Charles and ensuring the new systems functioned effectively. The responsibility of compiling that original report extended forward into helping manage the aftermath. The long-serving palace staff who had witnessed concerning patterns finally saw those issues addressed properly. These experienced administrators and advisors felt relief that someone had recognized the problems and taken action before permanent damage occurred. They worked diligently under the new protocols, grateful that institutional knowledge and traditional procedures were being respected again. The restoration of proper operations represented a victory for the many people who had served the crown faithfully through periods of uncertainty. Charles understood that this new reality would define the remainder of his reign. The king had no intention of softening his position toward Camilla or allowing her back into positions of genuine influence. Too much trust had been violated and too many people had been hurt by her manipulations. The cold distance between them would continue indefinitely as the price of her choices. Charles accepted this outcome as necessary, even while mourning the loss of what he had hoped their partnership would be. Do you think Camilla deserves the punishment she is getting? Let us know your views in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, watch the other videos on your screen.